Good morning, everyone. I'm Abby, your first presenter from Group 6. Today, we'll discuss about Chapter 6, which is about the population growth and economic development, its causes, consequences, and controversies. So, I'll be giving a quick overview on our overall topic. So, in this chapter, we will examine many issues that relate population growth to economic development. And to do that, we will begin by looking at historical and recent population trends and the changing geographic distribution of the world's people. And after explaining these basic demographic concepts, we will present some well known economic models and hypotheses regarding the causes and consequences of rapid population growth in contemporary developing countries. We will also discuss the controversies surrounding the significance of the population factor in general, and these models and hypotheses will be explored. So, finally, we will evaluate a range of alternative policy options that developing countries may wish to adopt in order to influence the size and the growth of their populations, as well as ways in which the industrialized countries can contribute to a more manageable global population and resource environment. And lastly, we will also learn about the population policies in China and India, which are the nations with the largest populations in the world.
Never before in history have there been so many people on Earth as right now. Our numbers have skyrocketed from 1 billion in 1800 to 2.3 billion in 1940, 3.7 billion in 1970, and 7.4 billion in 2016. The world population increased fourfold in the last century, so what can we expect for the next century? And what does population growth mean for our future? Will there be mass migration, overcrowded slums in megacities covering continents, diseases and pollution, chaos and violence over energy, water and food, and a human species focused only on sustaining itself? Will population growth destroy our way of life, or is this prophecy just ungrounded panic? In the 1960s, population growth reached an unprecedented rate, which led to apocalyptic prophecies. The poor would procreate endlessly and overrun the developed world. The legend of overpopulation was born. But it turns out high birth rates and the population explosion are not permanent features of some cultures or countries, but rather part of a four-step process the whole world is going through: the demographic transition. Most developed countries have already made the transition, while other countries are doing it right now. Let's go back to the 18th century, when the entire world, including Europe, was in the first stage of the demographic transition. By today's standards, Europe was worse off than a developing region, suffering from poor sanitation, poor diets, and poor medicine. A lot of people were born, but lots of them died just as fast, so the population hardly grew. Women had between 4 and 6 children, but only 2 of them would reach adulthood. Then the Industrial Revolution happened in the UK and brought the greatest change in human living conditions since the Agricultural Revolution. People went from being peasants to workers. Manufactured goods were mass-produced and became widely available. The sciences flourished and advanced transportation, communication, and medicine. The role of women in society shifted and created the conditions for their emancipation. Slowly, this economic progress not only formed a middle class, but also raised standards of living and healthcare for the poor working population. The second transition stage started. Better food supplies, hygiene and medicine meant people stopped dying all the time, especially so at a very young age. The result was a population explosion, doubling the UK's population between 1750 and 1850. The main reason families used to have lots of children was that only a few of them were likely to survive. Now that had changed, so the third stage of the transition was set in motion, fewer babies were conceived, and population growth slowed down. Eventually, a balance emerged. Fewer people were dying and fewer children were born, so the death rate and birth rate became stable. Britain had reached the fourth stage of the demographic transition. This didn't only happen in the UK, more and more countries went through the four stages. First, many births and many deaths due to bad living conditions. Second, better living conditions leading to fewer deaths and a population explosion. Third, fewer deaths resulting in fewer births and population growth came to an end. But if birth rates have dropped so much, why is the population still growing so fast? Well, the children born in the population explosion of the 70s and 80s are having kids themselves now, leading to a noticeable spike in overall population. But they are having far fewer children on average than their parents. The average today is 2.5, it was 5 40 years ago. So as this generation gets older and fertility declines further, the rate of population growth will keep on slowing. This is true for every country. In the West, we tend to overlook progress in other regions of the world, but actually most of the world's countries have made it to the fourth stage. Just look at Bangladesh. In 1971, the average woman had 7 kids, but 25% of them would die before the age of 5. In 2015, the mortality rate was down to 3.8% and women had only 2.2 kids on average. This is the rule, not an exception. We're not special, we just had a head start. It took developed countries about 80 years to reduce fertility from more than 6 children to less than 3. Others are catching up fast. Malaysia and South Africa did it in only 34 years. Bangladesh took just 20. Iran managed it in 10 years. All these countries that are catching up didn't have to start from scratch, and the more support they get, the faster they catch up. This is why programs that help lower child mortality or help poor nations develop are so important. No matter what your motivation is, whether you dream of a world where all people live in freedom and wealth, or you just want fewer refugees coming to your country, the simple truth is that it's beneficial to you personally if people on the other side of the globe can live a good life. And we are getting there. The percentage of people living in extreme poverty has never been as low as today. So the future of global population growth is actually not an apocalyptic prophecy at all. It's a promise. Population growth will come to an end. The UN forecasts that the 12th billionth human will never be born at all. And as the development level of the world rises, the number of people with a higher education will increase tenfold. Countries who used to be in need will help advance development instead. More people is going to mean more people able to advance our species. This video was a collaboration with Max Rosa and Our World in Data, where he explores the progress of humanity through research and data visualization. Make sure to check it out. In 2016, we were able to make more and better content than ever before because of your support on patreon.com. Thank you so much, and we'll be back in the year 12,017.
To formally start our topic, we have here a quote from Amartya Sen, a Nobel laureate in economics. According to her, economic development may be far from the best contraceptive that it is sometimes described as. On the other hand, social development, especially women's education and employment, can be very effective indeed. This means that women's literacy plays a big role in the economic development since people get married early mostly due to illiteracy, and because of this, they produce more children, thereby increasing the population. We all know that uneducated people tend to have less opportunity for employment, and it is also important to remember that inequality rises from poverty, which results to less economic growth. 6.1. The basic issue, population growth and the quality of life. So in 2013, the world's population reached about 7.2 billion. In that year, the United Nations Population Division projected that population would rise to about 8.1 billion in 2025 and that it will reach about 9.6 billion by the year 2050. The overwhelming majority of that population will inhabit the developing world. Notice how these projections or estimates done 10 years ago are unfolding in the current year. It is reported that the world population has reached 8 billion on November 15, 2022, according to the United Nations. And as of present year, 2023, there are about 8,20,191,174 people living in the world, and this is still increasing as of this moment. In this table, we can see that China has the highest number of population, followed by India with only a 37.2 million difference. We can also see our country is included in the top 20 with 113,601,985 people, which caused us to earn the 13th place in the largest populated countries out of 193 nations. We all know that overpopulation has caused many problems in our country since we are a relatively small nation holding about 298,000 square kilometers of total land area. This resulted to rising poverty rates, housing crisis, and unemployment. And we all know that Manila is one of the most densely populated regions, not only in our country, but in the world, with approximately 21,000 people living in 1 square kilometer. You might think that the main issue in overpopulation is the food shortages or poverty, but in fact, all the issues that I mentioned are due to people flocking over to the city. If you remember our discussion in chapter 2, it is said that the main reasons why people relocate from rural to urban places is because they are in the hopes or they are hoping to find better opportunities there. And these problems could have been avoided if only the people stayed in their local provinces and in turn made it stronger. This could have resulted in a more fluid nation, bringing equal opportunity for everyone, which would have strengthened our economy, meaning less poverty rates, less homelessness, and fewer problems. If you can remember, as I said during the discussion of chapter 2, that we could resolve this by spreading out the population while providing provinces enough support and the same opportunities as in the cities. And in turn, people from rural areas wouldn't have to move away, and these could lessen the nation's problems. So it is said here that every year, more than 75 million people are being added to the world's population. Almost all of this net population increase, or 97% of this, is in the developing countries. Increases of such magnitude are unprecedented. But the problem in population growth is not simply a problem of numbers, but it is a problem of human welfare and development as defined in Chapter 1. There are two views regarding this issue, the opposing and the supporting view. So the first one is the Malthusian theory or the opposing view. This will be further discussed by our next presenters. So this argues that population growth isn't desirable because it brings more problem to the economy, like food and water shortages or increased poverty. The other view is arguing that population growth is actually a good thing because population is a country's source of power, since high population growth means high work supply and more division of labor, meaning higher economic growth. Rapid population growth can have a serious consequence for the well-being of all humanity. And if development involve the improvement in people's levels of living, like income, health, education, and general well-being, and if it also incorporate the capabilities, self-esteem, respect, dignity, and freedom to choose, then the important question about population growth is how does the contemporary population situation in many developing countries contribute to or detract from their chances of realizing the goal of development, not only for the current generations but also for the future generations? Let us now take a look at world population growth throughout history under topic 6.2. So, for most human existence on Earth, humanity's numbers have been few. Here is a table showing the history of population. So, when people first started to cultivate food through agriculture 12,000 years ago, the estimated world population was no more than 5 million. 2,000 years ago, the population had grown into nearly 250 million. Then, from year one on our calendar to the beginning of the Industrial Revolution around 1750, this tripled to 728 million people. During the next 200 years, starting from 1750 to 1950, an additional 1.7 billion people were added to the planet's numbers. However, in just 4 decades, starting from 1950 to 1990, the Earth's human population more than doubled again, bringing the total figure of around 5.3 billion. So, when the world entered the 21st century, it had over 6 billion people. Population grew at an annual rate not greater than zero, and naturally, this overall rate was not steady. There were many ups and downs as a result of natural catastrophes and variations in growth rates among regions. By 1750, the population growth rate had accelerated to 0.3% per year. And by 1950, this rate had again accelerated, tripling to about 1% per year. And this continued to accelerate around 1970 when it peaked at 2.35%. Today, the world's population growth rate remains at a historically high rate of nearly 1.2% per year, but this rate increase is slowing down. However, the population growth rate in Africa is still extremely high, with 2.3% per year. The relationship between annual percentage increases and the time it takes for a population to double in size, or doubling time, is shown in the rightmost column of this table. We can see that before 1650, it only took 36,000 years, or about 1,400 generations, for the world population to double. And today, it would take about 58 years, or just 2 generations, for the world population to double at current growth rates. Moreover, it took 1750 years to add 480 million people to the world's population between year one and the onset of the Industrial Revolution. The same number of people is today being added in less than 7 years. This is the chart from the table which classifies the number of population by its level of development. As we see, in 1950, about 1.7 billion people lived in developing countries, representing about two-thirds of the world in total. And by 2050, the population of less developed countries will reach over 8 billion, or nearly 7/8 of the world's population. In the corresponding period, the population of the least developed countries will increase by tenfold, from about 200 million to 2 billion people. In contrast, the population of the developed countries will grow very little between now and 2050, even accounting for the immigration from developing countries. What is the reason for the sudden change in the overall population trends? The reason for these sudden changes is that for almost all of recorded history, the rate of population change, regardless if up or down, had been strongly influenced by combined effects of the following: famine or extreme scarcity of food, diseases, malnutrition, plague, and war. These are the conditions that resulted in high and fluctuating death rates. We can say that in the 20th century, such conditions came under control as the technological and economic conditions has improved. However, as a result, human mortality or death rate is now lower than at any point in human existence. This same decline in mortality was the driving force of rapid technological advances in the modern world. Advances in the medical field, improved nutrition, and the spread of modern sanitation measures throughout the world has resulted in the unprecedented increases in world population growth, especially in developing countries. In short, population growth today is primarily a result of rapid transition from a long historical era represented by high birth rates and death rates. The world's population is very unevenly distributed by three categories. Number one, by geographic region. Two, by fertility and mortality levels. And three, by age structures. For the first category, geographic region, regional geography is a branch of geography that deals with the division and study of the Earth into different regions. According to the United Nations, the world is comprised of these major geographic regions: Africa, Asia, Northern America, Europe, Latin America, and the Caribbean, and Oceania. It is said that more than three-fourths or 75% of the world's people live in developing countries, and fewer than 25% is living in an economically developed nation. So this figure shows the regional distribution of the world's population as it existed in 1950 and as it is projected for 2050. We can observe in comparison that all regions will slightly decrease in population except for Africa. Let's zoom in on the continental regions, and to get a better sense of this, we will be using a population map. So here is the population map of Asia and Oceania for the year 2018. We can see here that China and India are the biggest countries on this chart. However, the Australian continent is completely dwarfed by its neighboring countries, which are Indonesia and the Philippines. Within this world region, the population is very unequally distributed. For example, the Southeast Asia is densely populated, while large countries such as Mongolia, Australia, Kazakhstan, and the Asian part of Russia are home to relatively few people. The metropolitan area of Beijing has the same population as all of Australia, and Tokyo's population almost equal the population of all Oceania. While China and India clearly dominate, other Asian countries are also very populous. In fact, 7 of the world's 13 countries with more than 100 million inhabitants are in Asia. Moving on, let's take a look at the population of Europe during 2018. Geographically speaking, Russia is a huge country, but if we resize based on population, the nation looks closer in size to many other European nations. There are 711 million people living in Europe, which is only less than 10% of the world population. Five European countries have a population that is larger than 50 million. The European part of Russia, Germany, the United Kingdom, France, and Italy. So, for the sake of comparison, the population of China is almost exactly twice as large as the population of Europe. The Netherlands and Belgium, two countries with higher population densities than most European nations, also appear to be more noticeable on this map. Moving on to America's population during 2018, the population of America is roughly 1 billion. 428 million live in the South America, 587 million are residing in North and Central America and the Caribbean. The USA, or the third most populous country in the world, is also the most populous country on the American continent. Its population is as large as the population of Brazil and Mexico combined. On the map displayed, Mexico can be compared to almost four times the size of Canada in terms of population. That is because although the Great White North is the world's second largest country in size, it is only a fraction of the population in Mexico. Finally, we'll take a look at Africa, which is still in the middle of a massive population boom. So, one out of six people in the world live in Africa. It is considered to be the second most populous continent and is home to almost 1.3 billion people. Two countries in this continent have a population of more than 100 million. It is Nigeria with 195.9 million and Ethiopia with 107.5 million. The population density varies hugely on the African continent. The largest African country by land is Algeria, but it is relatively sparsely populated. And at the other end of the spectrum, we have Rwanda and Burundi. These two neighboring countries are densely populated and are both home to around 12 million people. Nigeria, which is expected to have the world's largest city by 2100 with over 88 million residents, is the largest country in Africa in terms of population. Moving on to the second category of the structure of the world's population, we have fertility and mortality trends. The rate of population increase is quantitatively measured as the percentage yearly net relative increase or decrease in population size due to natural increase and net international migration. Natural increase simply measures the excess of birth and over death, or in more technical terms, the difference between fertility and mortality. And although growing, the net international migration is of very limited importance as of today, unlike in the 19th and early 20th century, where it was an extremely important source of population increase in the North America, Australia, and New Zealand, and corresponding relative decrease in the Western Europe. Population increases in developing countries therefore depend almost entirely on the difference between their crude birth rates and death rates. You may recall from Chapter 2 that most developing nations have birth rates ranging from 15 to 45 per 1,000. However, in almost all developed countries, the rate is less than 15 per 1,000. Moreover, the developing country birth rates today are still often higher than they were in the pre industrial Western Europe. But there was a substantial decline in fertility over the past 3 decades, not only in countries like Taiwan, South Korea, and China, but also in nations where economic growth has been less rapid, including Mexico, Bangladesh, and in some areas where growth were stagnated, such as Zimbabwe. The total fertility rate, or the average number of children that a woman would have, has fallen dramatically in many countries ever since 1970, but this remains high in sub-Saharan Africa and Western Asia. Niger with 7.1 and Afghanistan with 6.2 were among the highest in the world. Modern vaccination campaigns against malaria, smallpox, yellow fever, and cholera, as well as the proliferation of public health facilities, clean water supplies, improved nutrition, and public education have all worked together over the past 3 decades to lower death rates by much as 50% in the parts of Asia and Latin America, and over 30% in much of Africa and Middle East. The death rates have fallen for all age groups. Nevertheless, the average lifespan remains about 12 years greater in the developed countries. This gap has been sharply reduced in the recent decades. For example, in 1950, life expectancy at birth for people of developing countries averaged to 35 to 40 years, while it is 62 to 65 years in the developed world. Considerable progress has been made on reducing the under 5 mortality rate. At this time, although the under 5 mortality rate declined from 184 to 144 per 1,000 in sub Saharan Africa, progress in the region continued to lag. In fact, during 2009, sub Saharan Africa had the lowest life expectancy of 51 years because of high under 5 mortality rates and the AIDS epidemic. Meanwhile, in the high income countries, life expectancy at birth averaged nearly 78 years. In East Asia and Latin America, life expectancies have now reached to an impressive 74 to 73 years respectively. Finally, note that there remains a biological susceptibility for old people to die at higher rates than younger people, and of course, this is due to aging. The last category speaks of age structures, meaning the proportionate numbers of people in different age categories in given populations for a defined time. Population is relatively youthful in the developing world. As a matter of fact, as of 2011, children under the age of 15 constitute more than 40% of the total population of low income countries, 32% of the lower middle income countries, but only 17% of high income countries. In countries with such age structures, the youth dependency ratio, or the proportion of youths under the age of 15 to economically active adults, or ages 15 to 64, is very high. Thus, the workforce in developing countries must support twice as many children as it does in wealthier countries. The main problems in more developed countries relate more to their low population growth and old age dependence. In general, the more rapid the population growth rate, the greater the proportion of dependent children in the total population, and more difficult it is for people who are working to support those who are not. This phenomenon of youth dependency also leads to an important concept, which is the hidden momentum of population growth. What is meant by the hidden momentum of population growth? Perhaps the least understood aspects of population growth is its tendency to continue even after the birth rates have declined substantially. Population growth has a built in tendency to continue, and the best example for this is a speeding automobile. When the brakes are applied, it tends to keep going for some time before coming to a full stop. And in the case of population growth, this momentum can persist for decades even after the birth rates drops. There are two basic reasons for this. The first one is high birth rates cannot be altered substantially overnight. The social, economic, and institutional forces that have influenced fertility rates for over centuries do not simply evaporate at the urging of national leaders. We know from experience of the European nations that such reductions in birth or in birth rates can take many decades. Even if developing countries assign top priority to the limitation of population growth, it will still take many years to lower national fertility to desired levels. The second and less obvious reason for the hidden momentum of population growth relates to the age structures of many developing countries. To understand this better, we use population pyramids or a graphic depiction of the age structures of the population. The shape of a country's population pyramid tells the story about the history of its population growth. For example, a high growth rate country has a pyramid that is narrow on the top and is wide on the bottom, like the last figure that I'll be showing later. And as family size decreases and women in society have fewer children, the shape of a pyramid changes. A population pyramid for a post industrialized country that has negative growth would be narrower at the bottom than in the middle, indicating that there are fewer children than middle age group. Each of the following pyramids rises by 5-year age intervals for both genders, with the total number of each age cohort measured on the horizontal axis. For this first figure, it illustrates the age structures of a more developed country. For developed countries, in the contemporary period, the population in middle cohorts is typically greater than that of young cohorts. This is partly, but not exclusively, viewed as transitional feature of a period in which women have been delaying birth until later in life. The next illustration is for developing countries. This figure clearly reveals that most future population growth will take place in the developing world. The steeper bottom acts as a stepping stone for the developing world as a whole, in contrast to a very low income country, such as the next illustration. The third and last figure mirrors the population of the least developing countries, including the Philippines. Notice how the young people greatly outnumber their parents. This means that when their generation reaches adulthood, the number of potential parents will inevitably be much larger than at present. This follows that even if these new parents have only enough children to replace themselves, the fact that the total number of couples having two children is much greater than the number of couples who previously had more children means that the total population will still increase substantially before leveling off. Some age brackets are increasing in size in some countries while decreasing in others. This reflects that in the demographic transition, the fraction of population of working age first rises and then falls. On the other hand, countries where the fraction of prime working age citizens is rising, they face a potential crisis if many remain unemployed, as this is associated with inequality and social unrest, not to mention the potential output loss. This rise is also an important window of opportunity for strong income and productivity gains, referred to as the demographic dividend, or a period in which there are fewer children to support, larger fraction of women join or remain the workforce for longer periods of time, and there are more available resources to invest in human capital. In contrast, where the fraction of people of working age is falling due to aging population, the resources needed for old age support is increasing. This is already a big challenge for most high income countries. And leading up to this period, a higher savings rate is required, but then allowing more immigration can also help. This transition is likely to pose an even greater challenge for the middle income countries with big drops in fertility ahead of previous historical patterns, most notably China, but also in several other Asian countries.
The consequences of high fertility, some conflicting perspectives. For many years, development economists and other social scientists have debated the seriousness of the consequences of rapid population growth. On the one hand, we must recognize that population growth is not the only or even the primary source of low levels of living, eroding self-esteem, and limited freedom in developing nations. On the other hand, it would be equally naive to think that rapid population growth in many countries and regions is not a serious intensifier and multiplier of those integral components of underdevelopment, especially the first and the third. The following discussion summarizes some of the main arguments for and against the idea that the consequences of rapid population growth led to serious development problems. It then considers whether some consensus can be reached so that specific policy goals and objectives can be postulated. Population growth is not a real problem. Here, the problem is not population growth but other issues. The other issues said here are the following. We have world resource depletion and environmental destruction. Here, population can only be an economic problem in relation to the availability and utilization of scarce natural and material resources. According to this argument, developed nations should curtail their excessively high consumption standards instead of asking less developed nations to restrict their population growth. The latter's high fertility is really due to their low levels of living, which are in turn largely the result of the overconsumption of the world's scarce resources by the rich nations. This combination of rising affluence and extravagant consumption habits in rich nations and among rich people in countries and among rich people in poor countries and not population growth should be the major world concern. Next, we have population distribution. According to this argument, it is not the number of people per se that is causing population problems, but their distribution in space. Many regions of the world and many regions within countries are viewed as underpopulated in terms of available or potential resources. Others simply have too many people concentrated in too small an area. Here, government should therefore strive not to moderate the rate of population growth, but rather to bring about a more natural spatial distribution of population in terms of available land and other productive resources. Third, we have underdevelopment. According to this argument, underdevelopment is the real problem, and development should be the only goal. With it will come economic progress and social mechanisms that will more or less automatically regulate population growth and distribution. As long as people in developing countries remain impoverished, uneducated, and unhealthy, and the social safety net remains weak, the large family will constitute the only real source of social security. Example, parents will continue to be denied the freedom to choose a small family if they so desire, to limit their size. Some proponents of underdevelopment argument then conclude that birth control programs will surely fail, as they have in the past, when there is no motivation on the part of poor families to limit their size. Last, we have subordination of women. Perhaps most important, as noted previously, women often bear the disproportionate burdens of poverty, poor education, and limited social mobility. In many cases, their inferior roles, low status, and restricted access to birth control are manifested in their high fertility. According to this argument, population growth is a natural outcome of women's lack of economic opportunity. If women's health, education, and economic well-being are improved along with their role and status in both the family and the economy and the community, this empowerment of women will inevitably lead to smaller family and lower population growth. Next argument, we have population growth is a false issue deliberately created by dominant rich country agencies and institutions to keep developing countries in their dependent conditions. The second main line of argument, denying the significance of population growth as a major development problem, is closely allied to the neocolonial dependence theory of underdevelopment discussed in Chapter 3. Basically, it argued that overconcern in the rich nations with population growth of poor nations is really an attempt by the former to hold down the development of the latter in order to maintain an international status quo that is favorable to the rich nations' self-interest. Rich nations are pressuring poor nations to adapt aggressive population control programs, even though they themselves went through a period of sizable population increase that accelerated their own development processes. A radical neo-Marxist version of this argument views population efforts by rich countries and their allied international agencies as racist or genocidal attempts to reduce the relative or absolute size of the poor, largely non-white populations of the world who may someday pose a serious threat to the welfare of the rich, predominantly white societies. Worldwide birth control campaigns are seen as manifestations of the fears of the developed world in the face of a possible radical challenge to the international order by the people who are its first victims. Third argument. For many developing countries and regions, population growth is in fact desirable. A more conventional economic argument is that of population growth as an essential ingredient to stimulate economic development. Larger populations provide the needed consumer demand to generate favorable economies of scale and production, to lower production costs, and to provide a sufficient and low-cost labor supply to achieve higher output levels. Population revisionist economists of the neoclassical counter-revolution school argue, for example, that free markets will always adjust to any scarcities created by population pressures, and such scarcities will drive up prices and signal the need for new cost-saving production technologies. In the end, free markets and human ingenuity will solve any and all problems arising from population growth. This revisionist viewpoint was clearly in contrast with the traditional orthodox argument that rapid population growth had serious economic consequences that, if left uncorrected, would slow economic development. All in all, many of these arguments have a certain realism about them, if not in fact, then at least in the perceptions of vocal and influential individuals in both the developed and developing worlds. The important point is that they represent a considerable range of opinions and viewpoints and therefore need to be seriously weighed against the counter-arguments of theorists who believe that rapid population growth is indeed a real and important problem for underdeveloped countries. Now, let us look at some of these counter-arguments. Population growth is a real problem. There are positions supporting the need to curtail population growth because of the negative economic, social, and environmental consequences, which are typically based on one of the following three arguments. First, we have the extremist argument. The extremist argument, population and global crisis. The extreme version of population as problem position attempts to attribute almost all of the world's economic and social evils to excessive population growth. Unrestrained population increase is seen as the major crisis facing humankind today. It is regarded as the principal cause of poverty, low levels of living, malnutrition, ill health, environmental degradation, and a wide array of other social problems. Value-laden and incendiary terms such as population bomb and population explosion are tossed around. Indeed, dire predictions of world food catastrophes and ecological disasters are often attributed almost entirely to the growth in population numbers. Such extreme position leads some of its advocates to assert that world population stabilization or even decline is the most urgent contemporary task, even if it requires severe and coercive measures such as compulsory sterilization to control family size in some of the most densely populated developing countries such as India and Bangladesh. We have the theoretical argument. Population poverty cycles and the need for family planning programs. The population poverty cycle theory is the main argument advanced by economists who hold that too rapid population growth yields negative economic consequences and thus should be a real concern for developing countries. Advocates start from the basic proposition that population growth amplifies and exacerbates the economic, social, and psychological problems associated with the condition of underdevelopment. Population growth is believed to retard the prospect for a better life for the already born by reducing saving rates at the household and national levels. It also severely draws down limited government revenues simply to provide the most rudimentary economic, health, and social services to the additional people. This, in turn, further reduces the prospect for any improvement in the levels of living of the existing generation and helps transmit poverty to future generation of low-income families. And because widespread absolute poverty and low levels of living are thus seen as major cause of large family size and large families retard economic growth, it follows that economic and social development is a necessary condition for bringing about actual slowing of cessation of population growth at low levels of fertility and mortality. But according to this argument, it is not a sufficient condition. That is, development provides people with the incentives and motivations to limit their family size. But family planning programs are needed to provide them with the technological means to avoid unwanted pregnancies. Other empirical arguments. See 7 negative consequences of population growth. According to the latest empirical research, the potential negative consequences of population growth for economic development can be divided into 7 categories. Its impact on economic growth, poverty and inequality, education, health, food, the environment, and international migration. First, we have economic growth. Evidence shows that, although it is not the culprit behind economic stagnation, rapid population growth lowers per capita income growth in most developing countries, especially those that are already poor, dependent on agriculture, and experiencing pressures on land and natural resources. Thomas Malthusson asserted that population was increasing faster than good production, which led to global starvation. And according to him, there is a relationship between economic development and population growth. Dodaro and Smith, 2009, claimed that when minimum levels of income per capita is reached, population begins to grow. Therefore, modern-day neo-Malthusian, poor nations will never be able to rise much above their subsistence level of per capita income unless they initiate preventive checks like birth control. The desired number of children can be expected to vary directly with household income, although direct relationship may not may not hold poor societies. It depends on the strength of demand for children relate to other consumer. Children in poor societies are seen partly as an economic investment goods in that there is an unexpected return in the form of both child labor and the provision of financial support for parents in old age. This is according to the microeconomic household theory of fertility. Second, we have poverty and inequality. Even though aggregate statistical correlation between measures of poverty and population growth at the national level are often inconclusive, at the household level, the evidence is strong and compelling. The negative consequences of rapid population growth most heavily on the poor because they are the ones who are made landless. They suffer first from cuts in government health and education programs and bears the brunt of environmental damage. Poor women once again bear the greatest burden of government austerity programs, and another vicious circle ensues. To the extent that large families perpetuate poverty, they also exacerbate inequality. Poverty exists when one or more person fall short of a level of consumption of goods and services deemed to constitute a reasonable minimum within some absolute sense or the standard of a specific society. And inequality have been hypothesized to negatively affect growth. Several challenges. It has to be noted that inequality may result in underinvestment in such as on education, health, and physical capital leading to lower growth. And the increase in inequality have a negative impact on economic growth. It is adversely interact with human capital to impede growth. Hence, it harm growth and that inequality is relevant for growth. Third, we have education. Education involves the demand for education, the supply of education, and the budget constraint. The demand of education may be fruitful analyzed on the basis of human capital theory, on the assumption that education is an investment, a rational weighing of present expenditure versus future return. The theory is much the same at the household, as the cost of education per child may be seen as affected by the number of children, whereas at the national level, there is increasing marginal cost with additional children. There is indeed some negative effect of population growth upon the amount of education in both less developed countries and developed countries. Although the data are sometimes ambiguous on this point, it is generally agreed that large family size and low income restrict the opportunities of parents to educate all their children. At the national level, rapid population growth causes educational expenditures to be spread more thinly, lowering quality for the sake of quantity. This in turn feeds back on economic growth because the stock of human capitals is reduced by rapid population growth. Number 4, health. Health facility harms the health of mothers and children. A World Health Organization population report published in 2005 explained that overpopulation is a breakdown of the ecological balance in which the population may exceed the carrying capacity of the environment, meaning that weakened food production leading to inadequate food consumption and malnutrition. A report from Cornell University suggests that malnutrition makes people more susceptible to life-threatening diseases like malaria and respiratory infections. From 1950 to 2007, malnutrition increased by 37%. Overpopulation has resulted in poor sanitary conditions and the destruction of rivers and water bodies, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, Asia, and other developing countries. Fifth, we have food. It refers to any nutritious substance that people or animal eat or drink or plants absorb in order to maintain life and growth. Famines tend to be thought as acute periods of crisis and are in that sense to be distinguished from more chronic manifestation of hunger that may in some places represent normal circumstances, despite being responsible for large number of deaths. Given the typically political nature of outbreaks of such famine crises, it may make more sense to look for an effect of population growth on the longer term trends of hunger and malnutrition. And according to Todaro and Singh, feeding the world's population is made more difficult by rapid population growth. A large fraction of developing country food requirements are the result of population increases, and new technologies of production must be introduced more rapidly, as the best lands have already been cultivated, and international food relief programs became more widespread. Six, we have the environment. Rapid population growth contributes to environmental degradation in the form of forest encroachment, deforestation, fuel wood depletion, soil erosion, declining fish and animal stocks, inadequate and unsafe water, air pollution, and urban congestion, meaning that the use of resources and the impact of environmental issues are not equally around the globe. For example, the United States, 5% of the world's population currently produce a full 26% of CO2 emissions. The most vulnerable people populations also experience decreased access to clean water, increased exposure to air pollution, and decreases which may result from decreased biodiversity and may feel the impact more immediately as local resources, including plant and animal deplete. 7. We have international migration. Many observers consider the increase in international migration, both legal and illegal, to be one of the major consequences of the developing countries' population growth. Though many factors spur migration, an excess of job seekers caused by rapid population growth over job opportunity is surely one of them. However, unlike the first six consequences listed here, some of the economic and social costs of international migration fall on recipient countries. Goals and objectives towards a consensus. Consensus. In spite of what may appear to be seriously conflicting arguments about the positive and negative consequences of population growth, There is a common ground that emerged on which many people on both sides of the debate can agree. Population is not the primary cause of lower living levels, but may be one factor. Population growth is more a consequence than a cause of underdevelopment. It does not no, it, it's not numbers but quality of life. Voluntary decreases in fertility is generally desirable for most developing countries with still expanding population. Population growth is not the primary cause of low levels of living. Extreme inequalities or the limited freedom of choice that characterize much of the developing world, the fundamental causes of this problem must be sought rather in the plight of poor families, especially women, and the failure of other aspects of domestic and international development policy. The problem of population is not simply one of numbers, but involves the quality of life and material well-being. Thus, developing country population size must be viewed in conjunction with developed country affluence in relation to the quantity distribution and utilization of world's resources, and not just in relation to developing countries' indigenous resources. Rapid population growth does serve to intensify problems of underdevelopment and to make prospect for development that much more remote. As noted, the momentum of growth means that, barring catastrophe, the population of developing countries will increase dramatically over the coming decades, no matter what fertility control measures are adopted now. It follows that high population growth rates, through through not the principal, though not the principal cause of underdevelopment, are nevertheless important contributing factors in specific countries and regions of the world. And in view of these propositions, we may conclude that the following three policies, goals, and objectives might be included in any realistic approach to the issue of population growth in developing countries. Some policy approaches. 1. Attend to underlying socioeconomic conditions that impact development. In countries or regions where population size, distribution, and growth are viewed as an existing or potential problem, the primary objective of any strategy to limit further growth must deal not only with the population variable per se, but also with the underlying social and economic conditions of underdevelopment. Problems such as absolute poverty, gross inequality, widespread unemployment, especially among women, limited female access to education, malnutrition, and poor health facilities must be given high priority. Their amelioration is both a necessary concomitant of development and a fundamental motivational basis for the expanded freedom of the individual to choose an optimal and, in many cases, smaller family size. 12. Family planning programs should provide education and technological means to regulate fertility. To bring about smaller families through development-induced motivations, family planning programs providing both the education and the technological means to regulate fertility for people who wish to regulate it should be established. And third, we have developed countries have responsibilities too. Developed countries should help developing countries achieve their lowered fertility and mortality objectives not only by providing contraceptives and funding family planning clinics, but also, even more important, by curtailing their own excessive depletion of non-renewable world resources through programs designed to cut back on the unnecessary consumptions of products that intensively use such resources. By making genuine commitments to eradicating poverty, illiteracy, disease, and malnutrition in developing countries as well as their own, and by recognizing in both their rhetoric and their international economic and social dealings that development is the real issue and not simply population control. So what can developing countries do? First, they can try to persuade people to have smaller families through the media and educational process, both formal and informal. Second, they can enhance family planning programs to provide health and contraceptive services to encourage the desired behavior. Such publicly sponsored or officially supported programs now exist in most developing countries. And third, they can deliberately manipulate economic incentive and disincentives for having children. For example, through the elimination or reduction of maternity leaves and benefits, the reduction or elimination of financial incentives, or the imposition of financial penalties for having children beyond a certain number. Establishment of old age social security provisions and minimum age child labor laws, the rising of fees and elimination of heavy public subsidies for higher education, and the subsidization of smaller families through direct money payments, although some form of population-related incentives or disincentive schemes now exist in over 30 developing countries like Singapore, India, Bangladesh, South Korea, and China have been especially prominent in experimenting with policies to reduce family size. For example, Singapore allocated scarce public housing without giving consideration to family size. It also limited paid maternity leave to a maximum of 2 children, scaling the delivery fee according to number of children, and reducing income tax relief from 5 to 3 children. And in 1984, it even went so far as to give special priority in school admission to all children born to women with university degrees, while penalizing non-degree holding women with more than 2 children. The presumed but dubious rationale was that educated women have brighter children whose births should be encouraged, while discouraging the less educated and presumably less intelligent women from bearing more children. But fertility fell so dramatically that by 2004, the city-state had introduced incentive to increase fertility, as with Japan and Europe, relaxed controls on immigration would be more cost-effective. Fourth, government can attempt to coerce people into having smaller families through the power of state legislation and penalties. For obvious reasons, a few governments would attempt to engage in such coercion. Not only is it often morally repugnant and politically unacceptable, so almost always extremely difficult to administer. The defeat of Indian Prime Minister Indira Gandhi's government in 1977 was largely due to popular resentment of the government forced sterilization programs. And finally, no policy measures will be successful in controlling fertility unless efforts are made to raise the social and economic status of women and hence create conditions favorable. The availability of income earning opportunities can lead young women to delay marriage by enabling them to become economically self-sufficient, and therefore in a better position to exercise control over their choice of partner and the timing of marriage. It can also reduce family pressures for early marriage by allowing women to make a contribution to parental household income. Furthermore, it enables women to consider the opportunity cost of additional children when childbearing competes with income-generating activities. In general, the availability of outside sources of income offers income offers women genuine alternatives to early marriage and frequent childbearing, which are often motivated by their lack of resource. And additional benefit of employment outside the home is that it reduces women's isolation, which is often an impediment to the provision of family planning services and can increase their household bargaining power. What the developed countries can do generally. One, many similar examples could be given of the gross inequalities in global resource use. Perhaps most important, one could cite innumerable instances of the unnecessary and costly waste of many scarce and non-renewable resources by the affluent developed nations. The point thereof is that any worldwide program designed to engender a better balance between resources and people by limiting developing country population growth through social intervention and family planning must also include the responsibility of rich nations to simplify their own consumption demands and lifestyles. and such changes would free resources that could then be used by poor nations to generate the social and economic development essential to slowing population growth. In addition to simplifying lifestyle and consumption habits, one other positive, if unlikely, internal policy that rich nations could adopt to mitigate current world population problems would be to liberalize the legal conditions for the international immigration of poor, unskilled workers and their families from Africa, Asia, and Latin America to North America, Europe, Japan, and Australia. The international migration of peasants from Europe to North America, Australia, and New Zealand in the 19th and early 20th century was a major factor in moderating the problems of underdevelopment and population pressure in European countries. No such safety valve or outlet exists today for developing countries. In fact, what few outlets existed have over the past 2 decades have been progressively closed. Yet clearly, many labor-scarce societies would benefit economically from international migration, and the benefit to developing countries would be more enormous. How developed countries can help developing countries with their population programs. There are two other activities more directly related to fertility moderation in which rich country governments, international donor agencies, and private non-government organizations can play an important assisting role. The first is the area of research into the technology of fertility control and contraceptive pills, uterine device or IUDs, voluntary sterilization procedures, and particularly in the age of AIDS, effective barrier contraceptions. Research has been going on in this area for a number of years, almost all of it financed by international donor organizations, private foundations, and aid agencies of developed countries. Further efforts to improve the effectiveness of this low-cost contraceptive technology when minimizing the health risks should be encouraged. The second area includes financial assistance from developed countries for family planning programs, public education, and national population policy research activities in developing countries. This has traditionally been the primary area of developed countries' assistance in the field of population. Total resources devoted to these activities have risen dramatically. It remains an open question, however, whether such resources, especially those allocated to premature family planning programs, might not have been more effectively used to achieve their fertility goals had they instead been devoted directly to helping low-income countries to raise the levels of living of their poorest people. As pointed out earlier, it is of little value to have sophisticated family planning programs when people are not motivated to reduce family size. We can conclude with a note of optimism that fertility rates in many of the poorest countries, such as Bangladesh and most of the countries in sub-Saharan Africa, have experienced an impressive decline. Population experts have lowered their estimates of world population growth for coming decades. And in no small part, this decline is a result of more widespread availability of family planning. This change helped set the stage for an opportunity for successful development efforts in the coming years. But developed countries need to do their part in providing expanded development assistance, especially efforts focused on the need and opportunity